I'm here today with Elizabeth Hagan. Elizabeth is the author of a new book titled Brave Church, Tackling Tough Topics Together. She's an ecumenical pastor at heart who has most recently served the Palisades Community Church in Washington, D.C. as senior minister. Though first ordained as an American Baptist, Elizabeth has also served United Methodist, United Church of Christ, Presbyterian USA, and Disciples of Christ congregations in various pastoral roles. She's a graduate of Samford University and Duke Divinity School. She previously authored Birthed, Finding Grace Through Infertility, and also serves as executive director of Our Courageous Kids, a foundation serving young adults who grew up in international orphanages with educational and mental health support. So Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to get to speak with you.
Thank you for having me today, Brian.
Sure. So you've got quite an eclectic denominational background, which is great to see. I'm a big supporter of that, quite frankly. But maybe you can tell us more about your background than I briefly touched on.
Sure. Yeah. I think, women in ministry, especially women who feel called to pastor and to preach, which I have for a long time, they have to kind of make their own way and go where there are opportunities to serve. I think I'm a free church person at heart. And so I kind of get into these more systematic denominations from time to time, and they say, why don't you stay? And I say, no, I have somewhere else to go. But I think my ministry has both been about the local church and also about connecting with wider ministries and organizations. I've done this not only personally, but we've done it as a family. My husband, Kevin, and I have done work together. He previously was the CEO of Feed the Children and of the American Diabetes Association. And as part of that, we did a lot of traveling and advocating on behalf of people that were struggling both with illness and also with hunger and education issues. And so right now, I am just amazed that my life has taken this turn into writing. It's not something that I grew up thinking, well, one day I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to publish a book. It began for me when I went through an infertility journey alongside my husband for many years. And I was a pastor of a local congregation at the time and really seeking out spiritual resources of people who would understand not only what it's like to go through infertility, there's tons of books on that, but what it's like to spiritually engage a process of longing for something and not having that longing fulfilled. And so what I found was there was not the book that I wanted to read on the market. And so I had these friends that said, well, why don't you write a book? And from that, my journey into being an author began. And I think once you realize that you can connect with a wider audience and share things that that are important, you kind of are hooked and you want to keep doing it because you believe in what you have to offer. And I think where my ministry has landed these days is that I know that my calling is to invite open-hearted Christians to engage in difficult conversations that foster a sense of belonging and acceptance. The people that I've been a privilege to be their pastor have often been people who have been rejected by traditional church or traditional patriarchal, sexist, homophobic models of church. And I think the topics that I'm really passionate of writing on are topics that help people feel less excluded and help people know that God loves them and that there's a place for them in the family of God.
Wow, well, good for you. I mean, we have a lot of interests in common, which is always wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
I am always fascinated how people get their first book deals because it's so, different, unique. Everyone's story is unique and sometimes convoluted. So how did that come about for you?
Well, I think the thing that I started doing, not because I was thinking, well, this will help me get a book deal one day, but just because I had all these words in me that I wanted to share, was I started a blog, back in the day, right? When everybody.
Yeah, sure.
And I had just become the senior minister of Washington Plaza Baptist Church in Reston, Virginia, which was a dream come true for me. I think I cried the whole first week, not because of anything other than I was just so happy because I had grown up in the Southern Baptist faith where women in my church are not even allowed to be ushers. And here I was, this little girl who had this calling to speak, and women weren't allowed to do that. And I went through my own journey to realized that it was okay for me to have a calling to be a pastor. And then when I was in seminary, people said, well, you'll never pastor a Baptist church. That's not going to be possible. And I was 28. I was 28 and got this amazing opportunity to pastor. And so I wanted to really chronicle that journey. And that's where the blog came from. I was preacher on the plaza back when people didn't want to use their real names on the internet.
Interesting.
Yeah. I was musings of a seminary student before that. But anyway.
Wow. Well, good for you for, having the courage to do it at that point.
Yeah. And from that, then I started writing for local papers, or I started writing in denominational journals or online sources, and people really took to it. And I said, well, maybe there's something here because that I'm speaking something that other people want to hear or just need someone to say. And then I was invited by several folks that maybe you might know. Carol Howard Merritt became a colleague of mine in the DC area. She invited me to join a writing group with her.
Oh, good.
And some other pastors. They were all women, and we met before she left town to go somewhere else. But we met every week or every other week for a long time. And I just was so encouraged by this group of passionate writers. They read my essays that I would bring in to our group, and they were so compassionate and kind, but also thoughtful, saying, well, maybe you should work on your verb tense, or maybe you should, reorganize these essays in some different ways, or maybe no one really wants to hear a published sermon, or whatever it was at the time. Real good truth. And I got more confidence through that process and got to the point, finally where I had written our infertility story and had a book proposal and began sharing that. And it was Chalice Press that published that. And I was very thankful for their enthusiasm about that project. And, it was a good first publishing experience.
Good. Well, yes. I mean, Carol has spoken at our conferences before.
Yeah.
And, I have a great relationship with the Chalice Press folks also. And so you just approached them directly? You didn't have an agent or anything like that? Is that how it worked out?
No, I mean, there were some other folks I had sent the proposal to, but I really think that there's value in creating community with not only other authors and other people in the publishing industry, but also with potential publishers before you're
Absolutely.
not just cold sending a proposal. Brad at Chalice Press was someone I'd spoken to before. We had some things in common. So it wasn't so much of like, well, who is this girl, Elizabeth Hagan, when he got my proposal, that it was something that he was expecting and looking forward to reading, and it worked out.
This industry is all about relationships.
It is.
Building relationships and networking. It's just so incredibly useful.
And I think you really need good writer friends. The person who connected us today was Dana Trent. She and I went to divinity school together, and she's my go-to friend. We've kind of been all along the same journey in many ways.
Dana's just awesome.
Together. And I find so much encouragement with having friends to call and say, okay, is this normal? Or... should I do this differently, or who should I call? And, we're always looking out for each other. Well, have you considered this, or let me connect you to this person. And I think once you realize that your calling is in a writing space, that different from a pastoral space, you have to really have your new community there of folks that are going to go the journey with you of what comes next.
And speaking of which, Joanna Bradley Kennedy from Upper Room Books is a good friend and spoken at several of our conferences too.
Yeah.
And your new book is coming out from Upper Room. So why don't we talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, and that's how Brave Church came to be. I was at Wild Goose Festival, I think it was in 2017, and I'd heard of her from my friend Dana, but I met her and we were able to have a conversation, and I was able to bounce some ideas off of her of what I was thinking about writing next. And I remember I went back to my hotel that night and I didn't sleep very well. It was like I was planning the book in my head. And that's what became Brave Church.
Wow.
I knew from that, and I was really happy to approach her and say, you were the first person I wanted to come to with this project because you really helped me begin really concretely thinking about this. So yeah.
Wow, very cool. So let's talk more about Brave Church specifically.
Yeah.
How's it structured? How's the book organized?
Well, let me tell you why I wrote Brave Church, because it has something to do with
Okay, sure.
my last book, which was, when authors publish, right, they go on a marketing journey of speaking with a variety of sources or congregations in my case. And when I was out talking about birth, I was calling colleagues and friends saying, can I come speak at your group or whatever? And I was invited on several occasions to come. But then when the date got closer of my speaking engagement, what happened was they said to me, could you please not talk about infertility?
Oh,
And
my.
that's what my book's about. They're like, well, we just don't think this is that relatable to our audience. We have a lot of older people, or, it's just a little taboo. And I'm like, well, that's the whole point. So, you in marketing,
Oh,
that's
man.
a plea of yours. Like, you have to get creative, right? Like, I knew I just didn't want to stop promoting my book. So I thought, well, what can I do that I can talk about it without people knowing that I'm talking about it? So what that looked like for me was I developed these workshops called unsilencing the grief that we don't, grief we don't talk about in church. So I went to several conferences where that's what I was talking with new friends about. And I asked them, what in your church do you not talk about? I know that people don't want to talk about infertility personally, but what else do people don't want to talk about? And I heard all kinds of things from, things that are included in Brave Church and things that are not, from, my son's in prison and I can't talk about it. Or, I'm really struggling with a situation. My daughter is experiencing domestic violence, or I'm not welcome at my church because I'm gay, or whatever it was. And I realized that the church actually needed more tools to help open up dialogue so that people felt like they could talk about these, quote, taboo topics, that we could understand that God is a part of all of these situations, especially because if we believe that God is close to us and experiences of pain and grief, if we don't talk about them, in fact, we're losing an opportunity to feel connection to God. And so that's really, what got a bee in my bonnet about Brave Church was I knew that it wasn't just infertility when we weren't talking about. It was so much more.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, I mean, part of the motivation that I had in launching How to Heal Our Divides was that when I was doing all this reading last year during the pandemic, a lot of good books about, anti-racism, political divide issues, religious divide issues. But so many of them were kind of like, okay, this is the history behind this, or, this is why it's an issue. Everyone should look inside themselves to understand their own biases. All really good things, but very little written about, okay, what do we do about it?
Right. Right.
So I love the fact that your approach is, what do we do about it?
Right.
Actually confronting issues that need to be addressed.
Right. And so what I did was I encountered this really amazing resource that came out of New York University. It was two social justice educators that began to see that conversations in their setting were not moving forward because this whole idea of safe space, we like to be around people that make us feel good and make us feel comfortable. And, in many ways, that's what church is for so many, as an aside. But anyway, what they noticed is these conversations in their school were not moving forward. And so they came up with this whole idea of brave space. And they had a different whole set of rules that was different from, our common keep the confidentiality, agree to disagree kind of ideas that come with any sort of small group setting. And they said, let's make some intentional space. Let's call it brave. And these are some things that we feel like need to happen if this is going to be a brave space, and created this whole plan that worked really well, they said, for their setting. And so I read this article and I was like, this is what we need to do in church. Like, could we set aside some intentional time where we call the space different, we call it brave, and we begin to start talking about things, even if it's just uttering the word racism, which I found is difficult in some settings. If we just begin to open up these conversations with some intentionality and some covenant around how we're going to interact with one another, That's what Brave Church became, a real tool to say, here, try this and do this and see what happens in your congregation. For me, what happened is I was teaching it as I was writing it, which was really wonderful feedback for me.
Good.
In my church, we had a whole summer where we were just doing Brave Church. And, the results for us were really cool. Like, for example, one thing that happened, in most churches, there's prayer or request time of some sort, joys and concerns. And most of the time, those things in my church, the way they are in almost every church in America, pray for my Aunt Sally who has cancer, or pray for this neighbor who just fell, or whatever it may be. But what I found after we, for example, went through the mental illness chapter and we began to talk about the deep-seated issues that are a part of our community and part of many families in our church that people had never really talked about before. I began hearing prayer requests for the first time ever for, a child who went away to a treatment center because of an eating disorder, or someone in the community who tried to commit suicide last week, and we really want to come around their family. I mean, it was, it seems like not a big deal, but to us it was huge. And we just all began to feel differently about each other, which is really the hope of Brave Church.
Well, there's so much pain that doesn't get unearthed, right? And dealt with. And, as you said, so many churches and organizations in general are just, reticent to address things that are pretty serious that need to be addressed.
Right. And there's people suffering, and feeling like nobody sees them. They feel alone. I mean, that was my experience. I mean, I was the pastor, for goodness sake, and going through these, miscarriage after miscarriage and failed infertility treatment. It was, I remember the Christmas Eve that I had just had an experience of loss. And I was supposed to be preaching, and I was so angry that there was a baby that somebody had put in, of course it's Jesus, I get it, but in a manger on the altar. And I was like, if I have to preach looking at a baby, it was so painful, but I somehow willed myself into doing it. But that kind of pain, like, how can we not begin to learn how to talk about it, that we can say, I'm really struggling right now, or my family's struggling, or my neighbor just had this devastating thing happen to them, or, my cousin feels unsafe in their home and I'm trying to figure out how to get them out without them dying. Like that's just such important conversation, more than the things that I think that we talk about, in our own Zoom coffee hours these days,
Yeah. Totally agree. So who's would you say is the primary audience for the new book?
Well, I've thought about that, and I think there's two audiences. One, it's for pastors or church leaders that feel frustrated with the division and the divide in our country. Those who are looking for a tool, a very practical tool, because that's what Brave Church is about, how to begin to not have a church that feels so, well, we can't mention this or people are going to leave. It's for brave church leaders who want to really lead on this topic. But I think this book is also for those who have experienced one of the situations that I write about in Brave Church, that be infertility and miscarriage, domestic violence, mental illness, racism, or sexuality. I hope that Brave Church can be used as a tool of reconciliation between a person and their faith community. For a person who's experienced one of these issues and doesn't feel like their church is safe, much less brave, that they could take Brave Church and they could go to their pastor or church leader or someone in their life and say, will you please read this book and understand what it has felt like for me to be both a part of a faith community and also struggling with this issue.
So your book is scheduled to release on June 1st.
Yes.
And, we're just kind of emerging from the pandemic. I've been doing interviews. Yay, there's the book.
There's the book. It's real. It's real.
Yay. I've been doing these interviews, for the last over a year during the pandemic, for people that were trying to launch a book when you couldn't do book tours or signings and things like that.
Right.
Are you able to set up more in-person events now, or is it more things like this online?
I mean, I think people are inching closer toward, thinking about in-person events. I had someone call me this week about something that's in the fall, and I think we begin to kind of think more about that with a positive tone these days as vaccinations increase. But I think, I'm having a virtual book launch party, for example, I mean, that's just what we do these days. And
Yeah,
I'm trying to speak as much as I can on podcasts and other online settings with folks like you, because I think that's where we're spending so much of our time, and we're gathering so much of our information about what's up and coming and happening these days.
Good. Well, I hope it goes well.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's been challenging to launch books during this period of time.
No, I know. I mean, I have some friends that launched a book maybe like April or something of last year. And I was your heart breaks for them, because we were all in such a fog about everything in our life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just think about one more thing. Yeah.
Right. So I mentioned, during the introduction that you lead an organization called Our Courageous Kids. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Well, I think I said in the beginning that my husband used to be the CEO of Feed the Children, a large international NGO that was based in Oklahoma City. And when he left that work, one thing that we really discovered as a family was that our calling and mission was really connected with the children that we had met through that experience, in particular the children who had grown up in orphanages that we had met. And so it was one of those things where I was, thinking like, well, should I do something, or do you just let it go? And I had this amazing friend who had listened to me talk about my real passion for kids that I'd met, in particular, a group of kids in Kenya. And she sat me down and said, okay, I'm ready to write you a check and I'm ready to throw you a party to raise money. When are you going to start doing something? Like, okay, you don't not listen to those conversations, right? And so that was in 2016, where, it was 2016 when Our Courageous Kids was birthed and went through the whole process of becoming a nonprofit. And in that journey that I've had with Our Courageous Kids, we've been able to send 2 kids fully to college.
Wow.
One went to a master's program in London, and one was a part of a school here in the U.S. and spent a lot of time with her, became like a daughter to us in that process. She spent all her breaks with my husband and I and my daughter. And, I've learned a lot. And I say, when I talk about Our Courageous Kids now, I talk not just about education and how important it is to empower kids, much like the foster care system in the U.S. When kids age out of international orphanages, there's no safety net for them. There's no one to invite them home for Christmas dinner, or to, help them buy their first car, or help them go to college, or have the tools they need for their success. But I've learned so much about mental illness from this process, and trauma. And even if a child grows up in the most fascinatingly beautiful, supportive childcare center, there's something that happens to the brains of these children when they're not in a loving, supporting individual family unit. And the trauma that brought them to being abandoned by their families or their place of origin. And it's just heartbreaking how mentally you can give them the best educational opportunities in the world. But if they are not in the right place to receive it mentally, it's going to mean nothing.
Wow.
And so I began supporting at a center, in addition to these scholarships, a center outside of Nairobi, a girls' home, a counseling program, so that the girls are able to begin to talk about their trauma and process it with a mental health professional, so that they begin the process of healing. I'm so glad for what I've learned in this work. And I was just listening to the mental health special that Oprah did with Prince Harry. Have you seen that? It's on Apple.
I've heard of it, but I haven't
seen it. It came out this week, and it was really fascinating to me. I was like, must be on to something. Oprah said the same thing. She's talking about starting her school, right, in South Africa, and how she had this grand vision of, I'm just going to educate these girls. They grew up in poverty just like me. And how much she's learned from her experience of starting a school, that it's not just about education, it's really about mental health. And the amount of girls that she had to sit in psych wards with, or suicides that she had to deal with, of
Mm.
us talking about that, just was mind blowing to her. And I could echo that experience.
Wow. Wow. Well, it's really so wonderful to hear about all the work that you're doing, Elizabeth. Congratulations on
Thank
accomplishing
you.
so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And, I hope this whole idea of, what I do is that I want to engage open-hearted Christians, which I know that you have a whole community of people around you that are of that genre. I want to do whatever I can with it, whatever I write next, that helps people have difficult conversations and helps people feel a sense of acceptance and belonging, because I think the church does so much damage in that department, that we don't help people feel accepted and included. And we need more voices like yours that are helping to heal our divides, and helping people feel like God loves them. Just the way
isn't that what church is supposed to do, right?
I know. It's
be leaders.
amazing to me when it's a new concept, but.
So I was going to just ask you if there are anything in terms of future books that you can talk about.
Well, I think my next project, I have begun, I want to really write about family estrangement, because that's been something that's a part of my own story, which people kind of look at me, as much as people used to look at me, now they're used to me talking about infertility, and I'd be really honest about that, and they'd be like, oh my God, you're talking about that. I think family estrangement is one of those other kind of difficult conversations, taboo topics. People don't talk about not having close relationships with their family of origin. But for me, that has been a really healing part of my own journey. And I really want to dive deep into some theological research on chosen family and what scripture I feel like has to say about that, and what Jesus has to say about that could be really encouraging to people like me who have lost that sense of connection to their biological family for reasons of health and safety.
Well, good for you for tackling another tough topic.
I know. I was telling my husband, I was like, I feel like I'm becoming that girl that talks about things that nobody wants to talk about. But
but that's a good thing. I mean,
right.
Honestly, for several perspectives.
I mean, maybe it's not good for marketing, but it does.
No, it's good because you're fulfilling a need, right?
Right.
And it's also since I teach how to market, for authors, what you're talking about is really strategically smart. Seriously.
Well, and it really comes out of, you know what it's like with all the authors that you talk to, it's such a huge undertaking to write a book and to publish a book and all the things that go into it. And it's not something you want to do unless you really have your heart in it.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I have some author friends, we like, well, how much do I work for an hour? And sometimes we feel like it's like less than a penny, but we do it because we feel passionate about what we have to say.
That's what it takes. There's just no question. That's what it takes, because it's a long road and it takes a lot of patience and perseverance, a lot of work.
Right. And a lot of multi skills. Sometimes we think, I don't want to, I don't have enough skills, I don't want to learn something new, but it really is more than just actually writing, although that's extremely important as you teach.
Good. Well, Elizabeth, really great to meet you and, learn about the work that you do. I'm so impressed and grateful for all that you've done. So thank you for that.
Thank you.